How do you know this? For whenever there is envy and strife and divisions among the people of God, are you not carnal and acting like mere men? There is the behavior of the world, and then there is spiritual behavior. And mature, godly, Spirit-led Christian will be a practical Christian. They will set about the work of the ministry of the gospel of Jesus Christ. They will change the spiritual environment in their home, in their workplace, in their church, and in their community. Listen to Paul, how he describes what it means to be spiritual in Galatians chapter 6. And you tell me if this is not the most practical definition you could ever imagine of what it means to be spiritual. Remember, the world says, and even many in the church, to be spiritual is to be mystic and detached and floating around and a little bit goofy. A flake, if you will, kind of floating around in the breeze. Listen to Paul. Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a trespass, that means if one of the brothers or sisters fall into sin, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. And then he goes on to say, bear one another's burdens if you're spiritual, and so fulfill the law of Christ. And if anyone thinks himself to be something when he's nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one examine his own work. And then he will have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another, for each shall bear his own burden. What is a spiritual person according to Paul? It's very simple. A humble person. A humble person who does three things. Seeks to restore backsliders. Seeks to bear the burdens of the weak who can't carry their own load. And thirdly, does not cry out for other people to help them when they're able to do their own work. And you do it all in a spirit of humility. That's a spiritual person. A spiritual person comes to church when they have a headache. A spiritual person pays their tithes when they don't see enough money to pay all the bills. A spiritual person shows up at the place of appointed duty and performs their ministry that they have committed to. They don't float in and float out. You know why? Because they're spiritual, and to be spiritual is to be practical. Is everybody following this? All right. When you learn to preach, they talk to you about laying out doctrine and then ending with application. Okay. This is based on the way the letters in the New Testament are set up. There is doctrine, and normally at the end there is a chapter or two, sometimes three, of very practical application. Sometimes we have it in our mind that the doctrine is the spiritual part and then the application is the practical part. No. Doctrine is spiritual and practical. You know how practical it is? Paul says in Romans 6:17 that you were slaves to sin until you encountered my doctrine. And it sets you free. Doctrine is about as practical as anything you'll ever find. And application is both spiritual and practical. When he says, put up with one another, that is practical, but it's also spiritual. When he says, love one another, when he says, forgive one another, that is both practical and spiritual at the same time. In Romans, first 11 chapters are the longest New Testament explication of Christian doctrine. It's both practical and spiritual. It is dense and delightful presentation of doctrinal truth, and I love it. But then starting with chapter 12, you get 4 whole chapters referred to in your Bible as practical application. Now, I want to share with you that I think those last 4 chapters are just as spiritual as the first 11 chapters. When you forgive somebody that wronged you, right? When you love somebody that's hard to love, when you come along somebody that's weak, you're being about as spiritual as you can possibly be because you're doing what Jesus would do if he were here. Now, how more spiritual can you be than that? When you get to chapter 12 to open that application section, that practical section, it begins with these words, and you all know them. I beseech you, therefore, my brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice. You want to be spiritual? Then you've got to give the Lord your body. And when your body doesn't want to go witness, you make your body go. When your body doesn't want to get up and pray, you make your body get up and pray. When your body doesn't feel like going to church, you make your body go to church. And then he goes on to say, and all the way Paul says, and this is your reasonable service. And then he goes on to say in the second verse, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Thinking right is spiritual. Sometimes we think spiritual is just, ooh, I felt something. No, you can have a spiritual thought, and it won't touch your emotions whatsoever. And all of a sudden you go, I understand now. I know what the Lord is saying there. So, there we have the first 2 verses, and he goes on to be very practical and spiritual in the rest of chapter 12. He says, don't think more highly of yourself than you ought. If you've got a gift from God, use it, and respect the gifts that God has given to other people. They're just as important as yours. And then he goes on to say, work and rejoice and give to those in need and bless those that persecute you, bless them and don't cuss them out. That's exactly what Paul said. And then he gets down to the end of that chapter, chapter 12. He says, don't be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. Good what? Good works. Practically spiritual. Then in chapter 13, which I preached on last week, he starts out by saying, obey the laws of the land. Be a good neighbor. Love your hard-to-love neighbor so they will be convicted. Love without hypocrisy. And then he comes to that section I preached on last week, and live as if the Lord could come back at any moment. That's being practically spiritual. Because remember, the night is far spent. His coming is closer than when you first believed. And then they go into chapter 14, and Paul continues to be practically spiritual. He says, oh, by the way, I understand that among you there are Jews and there are Gentiles. And the Jews are telling the Gentiles that they've got to eat according to the Old Testament dietary laws or they can't go in the rapture. And the Gentiles are telling the Jews that they should change the way they eat and eat like the world instead of the way they were raised. Paul condemns them both. He says, why are you talking about food? Focus on what is vitally important to help people get saved, become discipled, and make it into heaven. That's how God gets his glory. What did Paul tell the Corinthians? I will glory in nothing but this, Christ and him crucified. You know it's possible for the Lord to convict one person of one thing and not another? Right? He might have convicted you of watching, he convicted me once of watching too much Andy Griffith. I'm not going to stand up here and preach you'll miss the rapture if you watch Andy and Barney. But why did he convict me? Because instead of reading my Bible when I came home, I was so tired I'd watch Andy and Barney, and I'd memorized all the episodes. And I started to think. I had the mind of Andy instead of the mind of Christ. And Jim did one of the stupidest things. Is he still in here? He better be. And the first thought I had when Jim did that was not what does the Lord want? My first thought wasn't, what would my godly father who raised me, what would he do? My first thought was, if Opie had done this, what would Andy do?